congratulate Ugandans for having their own airline and the staff. And I ask you to fight corruption. Don't allow corruption in the new airline.
Barely a month before Uganda Airlines celebrates its second birthday, it continues to ascend into turbulent skies as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to inhibit travels, its flight destinations, this as internecine fights for lucrative deals, cronyism and factionalism threaten to send the carrier into a nosedive, with employees seeking to feather their nest during the early days of the airline, which made a loss of 102 billion shillings according to the recent Auditor General's report. There are fears that the ghosts of the past airline have returned to haunt the revived national carrier.
The airline was infiltrated immediately by some corrupt elements, employing their relatives, over-budgeting, over-inflating procurement costs. Terrible, terrible things. When I got information, I moved in and I dispersed the whole group.
Uganda Airlines, established by former President Idi Amin in 1977, was run down by top officials in the NRM current regime, first by stripping off its lucrative ground handling business, officials flying for free, ministers running late, delaying flights from taking off, and regime cronies staffing the airline company with friends, relatives and in-laws. Barely months to the revived Uganda Airlines' second birthday in August, the worst fears, which were bubbling below the radar, came to surface when Works and Transport Minister General Katumba Wamala sent several airline top officials on forced leave, and a week later, the entire board on forced leave to pave way for investigations into, among others, corruption.
To the Middle East, to Asia and to Europe.
The suspension affected the Chief Executive Officer, Conwell Muleya, Director of Marketing, Roger Wamara, Human Resource Manager, Joseph Sebowa, and Director of Safety, Bruno Oringi. The board, led by former Rubanda East Member of Parliament, Perez Ahebwe, and others, Benon Kajuna, Godfrey Semugoma, Catherine Asinde Poran, Rehema Mutazindwa, and Stephen Aziku Zua, according to investigations by NTV, was the culmination of months-long fights. In a May 21, 2021 report to Katumba Wamala, Ahebwe, who was seeking audience with the president after his suspension, blamed the CEO, Muleya, whose style of leadership he described as divisive and toxic. Ahebwe detailed that several departments had been filled with former employees of the defunct Air Uganda, where Muleya worked, who formed cliques inside Uganda Airlines to the extent that some staff would bypass direct supervisors and directly report to the CEO. Muleya, who first worked as a technical advisor during the revival of Uganda Airlines and subsequently elevated to chief executive in September 2019, for 2 weeks did not respond to our request to comment on the matter. The board, in numerous correspondences, also accused former Junior Transport Minister Joy Kabatsi, who was also dropped in the recent reshuffle, of frequently interfering with operations of the airline, which was unusual. Kabatsi, however, told NTV that the Ahebwe-led board was too incompetent. She declined a request for a lengthy interview subject to the ongoing investigation ordered by the president, but briefly revealed that, and I quote, "What I can tell you is that place had many issues. The last meeting I called, the board did not show up. They used to say they only report to my then senior, General Katumba, and Mr. Kasaija, Finance Minister. I later wrote a letter raising some of the issues at hand. Then I learnt later everyone had been suspended." Earlier on April 26th, Kabatsi had written a letter detailing key issues at the airlines, including the board involving itself in recruitment of staff at all levels, while the Chief Executive Officer, Muleya, was failing to rein in on errand staff. However, in a response, Muleya noted that the board's involvement in procurement was an anomaly arising out of conflict of interest, and that he had attempted to rein in on errand staff, some of whom routinely sought intervention of board members and their godfathers elsewhere in government, and his decisions were overturned. In another rejoinder dated May 10th, the board deflected the issues as technical aspects of the airline as opposed to governance and oversight. But in an earlier confidential correspondence in January 2021 prepared for the president, Muleya raised concern on a number of issues about the board, including incompetence and lack of technical aviation experience and the tendency by some board members in influencing procurement deals. He also accused procurement managers of having ties with influential people in government ministries. He wrote, and I quote, "They advise that I must try to understand how business is done in Uganda because these practices are normal in this country. They have gone so far as to suggest that our ethical approach to management may be one of the reasons why we are experiencing delays in the release of company project funds from the ministries within government," end quotes. For instance, he detailed that auditors from the Auditor General's office had requested for between 100 to 150 million shillings to write a favorable report, while a certain top official sought a $50,000 or an equivalent of 176 million Uganda shillings inducement. He detailed that the airline requires 218.966 billion shillings in the first quarter of the year, which includes arrears from the last 2 financial years. In the next financial year, 2021-2022, the aviation industry was allocated 1 trillion shillings. However, this does not portray a complete picture of what is required to run the carrier. According to the airline's business and implementation plan, a copy seen by NTV, for Uganda Airlines to be effectively run, they needed a staggering 3.7 trillion shillings in its first year of operation, 4.1 trillion shillings, 4.5 trillion shillings, 5 trillion shillings, and 5.5 trillion shillings in the second, third, fourth and fifth years respectively. If this were followed, it would be one of the items which would take the lion's share of the budget and dwarf the health sector, which was allocated 2.7 trillion shillings this financial year at the time the coronavirus is ravaging the country. But since its launch in 2019, the airline's budget has not been met. According to the Human Resource Plan, the CEO was to earn 60 million shillings monthly, 4 million shillings for a personal assistant to the CEO, a driver 2 million shillings, 50 million shillings for the chief finance officer, revenue accountants 15 million shillings, revenue accounting clerks 2 million shillings, a marketing manager 40 million shillings, a human resource manager 30 million shillings, IT manager 25 million shillings, among others. Sources told NTV that regime cronies sent relatives and friends to jostle for the well-paying jobs, especially in the non-technical fields. Latching from one crisis to another, the airline has been affected by other issues including inflated air tickets, unnecessary travels by both management and the board, the poor state of the airline stations in countries where the airline launched, flawed procurement deals, and dubious fuel deals, especially on the Mogadishu route involved a UPDF general we cannot name for legal reasons. At the receiving of the first 2 Bombardier jets in April 2019, the former board chairperson, Gad Gasatura, warned about some of these issues which led to the collapse of the first airline.
And the 3 major causes, there are others, but the 3 major ones. 1 is undercapitalization. 2, political interference. 3, sheer management incompetence. On capitalization, the government has committed to fully capitalize this airline. Similarly, government is committed to avoid causes that caused the last airline to fail. On sheer management incompetence, that's our part.
But at the same function, the airline spent 778 million shillings for hosting 600 guests, an average of 1.2 million shillings per guest, and for the event to receive the first Airbus, the airline spent 119 million shillings for 350 guests, the equivalent of 340,000 shillings per guest. In his State of the Nation address on June 6, 2021, President Museveni promised to stamp out graft at the airlines.
The young passionists are liberating the Uganda Airlines. The resistance movement in the Uganda Airlines was by these young passionist people there. It is easy for the NRM to defeat corruption.
So I always go to
In his May 21st report to General Katumba, the board chairperson, Ahabwe, opens up about the toxic environment at the airlines when he cautions on the re-employment of the former commercial director, Jennifer Bamuturachi, who had been terminated in October 2019, according to her probationary report, on among other grounds, and I quote, being more concerned with politics than team role and interest of the airline, lacking commitment to role, doing things of her interest and ignoring other roles, and being hostile to those of different opinion, I end quotes. She, however, unsuccessfully petitioned the industrial court and later the Labour Office in the Ministry of Gender for unfair termination, seeking 3 billion shillings, to which the airline management counter-offered 1.4 billion shillings in February this year, but she rejected it through her lawyers and on April 29th withdrew the complaint. Sources say at the behest of the president, Bamuturachi bounced back in May at the airline, first as the aide to the interim CEO, Captain Stephen Wegoye, and later as acting CEO and part of the team superintending over the investigation into the long-running mess.
Distinguished guests, as on your man from flight deck captain, we're happily cruising at 29,000 feet above the sea level.
To some observers, it was always a matter of time for the new airline to fly to turbulence, as history has an uncanny way of repeating itself.
It will be about 9 minutes and be commencing in descent.